We left off at trying to figure out what the background concentrations of nutrients were, so that kind of give you your best case. One of the things that is really in eutrophication of lakes is really important is not getting to a point where the hypolimnia goes anoxic. So as the lake stratifies, there's some carbon down there, and if it's highly productive in the surface waters, then all that organic material can fall down into the hypolimnion. It won't mix, right? So the molecular diffusion across the metalimnion is very slow. So the heterotrophic organisms will eat up that organic material, and if there's enough of it, they can cause the oxygen to disappear from the hypolimnion. When this happens, phosphorus comes up again from the sediments, and that is called internal loading. And if that's the case, then it can take many years to recover from eutrophication, even if there's control of point sources and non-point sources. And we'll see specific examples of places where they caught it before or where they didn't catch it until after. This is one of the true thresholds in biology, and it's driven by a very basic chemistry that's quite straightforward. So this is a review. This came up when we were talking about the iron cycle. And we have on top, we have the hypereutrophic lake. And I should probably switch this so this is green. But I could maybe I should redo that. Let me make this up. And in this case, the oligotrophic lake, it's oxic all the way down to the bottom. So the very surface of the sediment is oxic as well. All right, and you remember that iron and phosphate in oxic conditions will precipitate to make ferric phosphorus, iron phosphate. But as soon as it goes into an anoxic condition, then the Fe3 plus, remember PO4 3 minus Fe3 plus, right? But when it's here, the iron wants to be Fe 2 plus, and the phosphate will stay 3 minus, and so they don't match up to each other anymore, right? So they dissociate. If you're in a sediment that's in an oligotrophic lake, this happens in the anoxic sediment down there because the organic material gets all down into the sediment and stored there. And then there's this oxidized microzone where if the iron and the phosphate diffuse up, they re-precipitate. So the phosphorus is trapped here. In a eutrophic lake in the fall, when it turns over, all that iron and phosphorus comes back up. So the phosphate's able to get out of the sediment and can continue to build in the lake. Okay, so that's a really important aspect of controlling lake eutrophication. And we'll come back to that. There's one more aspect of eutrophication in lakes that we want to talk about before we move out of this section. And that is how you control macrophytes. And so I put a grass carp up here because that is one way that people manage macrophytes. It's an herbivorous carp from China, and it's part of the carp polyculture systems that are there that we'll talk about a little bit later. And if you have too many macrophytes growing, you can put some of these into the lake. The couple problems with that, one is that you don't want to put, that you can get triploid ones that are sterile. So in the southern portions of the United States, you don't want them to create reproducing populations. They would be invasive. But if you use the sterile ones, you can keep them from reproducing. The other problem is if you put too many of them in, you'll strip all the macrophytes out. And so that basically a balanced system should have some macrophytes in it. It provides some refuge for fish to reproduce and invertebrates, as well as there's a allelopathic interaction with phytoplankton. So you have a state, if you get rid of all the macrophytes, you tend to move more towards a higher probability of phytoplankton blooms and too much algae. So here are some ways that people control macrophytes. Physically, you can cut or dredge macrophytes, and this you can get good control. It can be costly to do it again. It needs to be repeated. Quite a few people have property on lakes in the upper Midwest, and the macrophytes will grow thick and impede swimming and fishing in areas near their property. So what they'll do is they'll just go out and cut the macrophytes or dredge them. And you can do that by, I don't know, pulling an old mattress springs across the bottom of the lake. They'll sort of tear them out. And then you've got this compost that you got to do something with. It makes sense. It's kind of like mowing your lawn, right? You just got to do it every once in a while and maintain it, and then it doesn't take it out. There's a lot of chemical applications, herbicides that can work, and it can affect non-target species. It also needs reapplication, and the toxins can be biomagnified. This can be particularly helpful in areas where you're trying to get rid of like all the invasive macrophytes in a lake or something before they spread out. You know, you can just nuke them and they're gone. You can seal the sediment. If you just put plastic on the bottom, they can't grow, at least the ones that are rooted. And it also keeps phosphate from re-entering the lake and can inhibit phytoplankton blooms. You can't do this in really large lakes, obviously. And then I'm not sure everyone wants a plastic bottom on their lake either. So that's another thing that you can do. I don't actually have that in here. Wait, maybe it's the next page. No, I don't necessarily have that in here, but we also talked about in reservoirs, if you lower the level in the winter, you can dry out and freeze the macrophytes, and then when it comes back up again, they're gone. So that's another method that's used. And then the biological control, which was the grass carp we talked about, they can be inexpensive, but they can be pest species and impossible to eradicate after introduction. So there's that toss-up, and eventually herbicides will go away, but an invasive species you can't get rid of once it's really well established. It's very few cases where that's been worked. Well, can you mulch the bottom or instead of covering it with plastic like deep rocks? I mean, the problem with deep rocks is that the rocks would just grow over it would establish on the rocks, right? So the idea with the plastic is it completely seals everything off, and so it sort of holds those macrophytes down there. If there's any seeds or roots left in the sediment, they still can't get out. It's pretty much the same thing as like if you have a rock garden and you put a layer of plastic and then you put the rocks on top, right? If you just put the rocks out, then the stuff would come up from underneath more easily. What are some of the reasons for wanting to manage the macrophytes? Oh yeah, well, if a lake is completely filled with macrophytes, you can't boat, you can't swim, you can't fish. So it can be, the things that people want to do on lakes become impeded. So that's a good question. I should have said that. I'm not sure about treated mulch. It might help. The problem with mulch is you're adding more organic material into the lake, so you would push it more towards the eutrophic condition and the hypolimnia. So I'm not sure that's the greatest idea. Right. And literal mulch would probably float too, at least for a while. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit now, and we'll come back, but we're going to talk about streams and wetlands, because lakes are not the only thing. Even though historically the most attention has been paid to lakes, they're not the only thing. And the methods are not as clearly defined, but in general, the same principles are the same. And that is, the central principle in general is controlling the sources of nutrient is better than treating the symptoms. Right? So it's just like a disease. If you want to keep somebody from having a heart attack, dying from a heart attack, it's better to use diet and exercise to treat up front rather than have to go in and do open heart surgery and ream out arteries and things like that. So just like with lakes, there's a relationship between the amount of nutrient in the water and the chlorophyll, but this is benthic chlorophyll now growing on the bottom. The relationship is not as tight. It's sloppier because rivers and streams have floods, and they can scrape off the bottom of the benthic algae off. So it's a little bit less of a tight relationship. Still, there's a significant positive relationship up to a point, and then we reach a threshold where any more additional nutrient doesn't seem to result in additional algal biomass. And just as with lakes, if you have more of the other nutrient between nitrogen and phosphorus, you get a bigger response. So we can look at that and see, we're on the nitrogen axis. So when N to P is low, right, when there's a lot of phosphorus per unit, nitrogen, you get a higher amount of algae than if N to P is high, if you have a lot of nitrogen to phosphorus. Okay, what that means is if there's too much nitrogen, you're pushing into phosphorus limitation. If there's too much phosphorus, you're pushing into nitrogen limitation. But the ratio is what's important. Again, ecological stoichiometry. So here's the first question of the day. Why should a manager trying to control nitrogen to decrease chlorophyll and consider this threshold? And so let's just say we've got two examples. We have a manager with a stream up in here that's at 2,000 micrograms per liter total nitrogen, and wants to bring it down to what do we have, 700, or another manager that's at 700 and wants to bring it down to 100. Which one do you think is going to be useful of those two? Right. That's good. People are starting to get the answer. The idea is the threshold here means that, if you're up here and you start decreasing the nitrogen, you're not going to see any response until you get below this threshold. And even then, you could, because of the variation, you could not see it. You'd really, if you wanted to control it, you'd have to really get down in this region where there's very few sites that have chlorophyll that's high. In terms of eutrophication in streams, it's not quite as bad as far as anoxia because there's continuous mixing. And what people really don't like is, in general, is when chlorophyll exceeds 100 milligrams per meter squared. It just looks really yucky on the bottom, right? And so there's that. And then there's also some of these cyanobacteria can be toxic. So where does the control start in a hyper-eutrophic stream? Well, there is none in hyper-eutrophic if there's tons of nutrients. The control starts if you can bring the nutrients down past this threshold. Somebody also mentioned about bubbling lakes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But yes, if you force oxygen into the hypolimnia, that's part of the reason they bubble lakes. And they basically destroy the hypolimnia, and so the whole thing mixes, and that's oftentimes. So that's a useful strategy. And then we can also think about trophic state and sewage treatment, because really one of the older senses of disturbing trophic state was dumping untreated sewage into rivers and streams. And really up until the 60s, that was the way almost everyone in the world did it, everywhere. And we can go back to quick question. Why does a manager want to decrease chlorophyll? Well, because if the concentrations are too high in streams, people don't like it. They think it's yucky. It also can lead to other problems like taste and odor problems, and it can push the system into one that does not have the proper productive fisheries and those kinds of things. A lot of times.
With saying chlorophyll, is that just synonymous with saying like an algae bloom?
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's what we use to determine algal biomass. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
I should have been more clear about that. Thanks.
That's okay.
Good. Any other questions back on that? I like all these questions. Okay, so we basically have on the left, we have old school, dump all the sewage in or treat it minimally, and new school, advanced sewage treatment, right? And one of the things that people started realizing is if we dumped a bunch of biological oxygen demand into the river, it would, take it up and use it eventually. But in doing so, it would cause anoxic conditions. The Kansas River, which is right near here, in the 60s was a no contact recreation river. it would go anoxic. It had high numbers of pathogenic bacteria in it. And as the regulations from the first versions of the Clean Water Act came into play, the sewage systems got basically mandated to take biochemical oxygen command and pathogens out of the water. So in this old school, they're dumping a bunch of nitrogen in. Because the sewage was anoxic, ammonium would be the predominant form, and it would be high. The soluble reactive phosphorus would be high because of all the phosphates and the detergents. And then eventually nitrate would get high downstream. Why is the ammonium converting to nitrate? Once that oxygen comes up a little bit. Okay, anybody remember what happens when you... Go ahead.
What was the question again?
Why would the ammonium in the river be all of a sudden converting? The ammonium's going down, the nitrate's going up, right? Now, once there's a little bit of oxygen there, what process is it that's moving ammonium into nitrate when there's oxygen there?
I'm guessing it has to do with the redox capacity if there's more oxygen.
It certainly does. And ammonium has more potential energy than nitrate when there's oxygen, right?
Is it nitrification?
Anybody remember? Pardon?
Is it nitrification?
Nitrification, yes. Good. And then we have specific types of organisms that are associated. Because of the anoxia, any of the clean water organisms can't make it. The bioindicators, like we talked about, EBT, Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, Trichoptera, not going to find them there, right? So the bioindicators are gone. We have what first thing that forms is called sewage fungus. It's not really fungus, it's a bacterial mat it's a bacterial mat that is just thick and white, and usually it's white because it's a precipitating sulfur in it from the sulfide that's coming off. And protozoa can do okay in anoxic conditions. And then we get cyanobacteria, lots of cyanobacteria, because they can withstand anoxia better than the eukaryotic algae. And then we'll get big blooms of something like Cladophora from all the nutrients. And then eventually diatom and algae. Lots of pathogenic bacteria slowly falling off as we go down. Tubifex, some of you might use it for fish food, is able to deal with anoxia. And so it would be the one, sometimes sewage worms they're called. And then on the left-hand side of these is actually the levels that each of these things is coming above from the stream above. So again, we have modern sewage treatment plant. They take the biochemical oxygen demand out. They drop the number of particulates out. So the oxygen dip's not going to be nearly as severe because there's not so much respiration. Oftentimes they'll have an oxidizing step that converts the nitrate to ammonium. Ammonium's toxic. And so it's regulated, the amount of ammonium and biochemical oxygen demand and pathogenic bacteria you can release. So oftentimes the nitrate will predominate, and the ammonium will go up as some of that's used and remineralized. Soluble reactive phosphorus will be lower if there's detergent bans, and there's also chemical methods for removing nutrients from sewage. All of this stuff is going to move up and compress basically because there's no anoxic film, right? As opposed to there, And the pathogenic bacteria are lower to start with and drop off, and maybe almost no sewage fungus. Unlikely to have clean water, very much clean water fauna until you move downstream a little bit away from that, some of those impacts. But we see that regulation of sewage into rivers and streams has had a real positive effect. So the Kansas River and many rivers around the country are way better, in way better shape than they were for many, many years since the 50s or 60s. Another example being the city of Denver and the surrounding suburbs dumping pollutants into the Platte River. only a few years ago were there actually trout swimming in the Platte River in downtown Denver because it was just so polluted up until that point. And it just took a long time to get back to another place. And these stories are common throughout the developed world, anywhere where they're treating sewage. Unfortunately, there's many places still where they're not. Many places developed, Brazil, all of Central and South America, most of the sewage is not treated. Many places in Spain don't treat it. There's just a lot of countries that it just pours right into the rivers. So we're going to talk about some case studies of eutrophication. We'll start with Lake Washington, a classic, and go through some of the other lakes that we're talking about. So the first one's Lake Washington, and here Tommy Edmondson, who was a professor there, and it was a student of G. Evelyn Hutchinson's. You'll remember that name perhaps from earlier in the class. He noticed a shift to those species that the European limnologists had noted were indicative of eutrophic conditions, particular species of cyanobacteria, for example. And as a result, he started pushing, and other people picked it up, to control the raw sewage input into Lake Washington. And the lake recovered. And then one of the key things here is that the trophic state was controlled before the hypolimnia went anoxic. And this is a picture of current day Lake Washington. And we can see the University of Washington. I think that's right here. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's up here. And it's a pretty blue lake, right? And now the tech industry is all developed all around, but the suburbs that were all around were dumping all their sewage right into Lake Washington. So they had to consolidate all that, and they basically dump it out into the Puget Sound now. And they've started, now they're being pressured to treat it better going into the Puget Sound. So this is one example of really big fights over eutrophication. When Edmondson put out this science that basically said, look, you can't keep adding phosphorus or you're going to get cyanobacterial blooms. They're going to get worse and worse. Hypolimnia is going to go anoxic. You know, and he was doing this in the late 50s. He was really attacked for this. And you know, he's saying, well, the oxygen is going to run out for the organisms in the water. And so one of the retorts of the public was, there's plenty of oxygen. Don't you know what the chemical structure of water is, right? H2O. So there's some really interesting and ugly attacks that were against him just because he was making the scientific argument. And he's got a whole book on that, Uses of Ecology. And if you're interested, I'll send you a link to that. So this is the total phosphorus in the lake in terms of metric tons. And we see that, but with the sewage control, it dropped considerably. And here's the chlorophyll, right? From 1961 to 1979, a proxy for algal blooms, Emma. And we see that every summer we got these blooms that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they started controlling it and they kind of went down. And the last graph here is a proportion that are cyanobacteria. So of all the algae, they looked at the total number of algal cells and then use that, the number of cyanobacterial cells divided by the total number of algal cells. And we see that every summer we had these blooms where almost 100% of the bloom was cyanobacterial, and after this is controlled, there's a time lag of maybe 5 years or so, but we see we eventually go down to almost no cyanobacteria. Okay, so this is one of the triumphs of limnology that's held up as a case study for why you should grab that phosphorus out of the system before the hypolimnia becomes anoxic. And you know, going along with this, they've tried to restore a lot of the streams for salmon and keep the salmon runs going. There's some locks, ballard locks, that allow the fish fish passage to go up through, even though they put ships up and down through small boats, at least up and down through the locks into Lake Union. So Lake Union's in Seattle. It connects to Lake Washington. And actually, from the restoration of the streams, they opened the first recreational salmon fishery in the lake just, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. So this is a lake where the water quality has continued to improve due to management. Another example is one where they pushed it past that point. And this is a lake in Sweden, Lake Truman, 1 meter deep, had horrible water quality, frequent fish kills. They said, okay, we'll control the phosphorus. And they basically piped the sewage out of the watershed somewhere else, controlled the point and non-point sources of the lake. The problems continued. And because this lake was so eutrophic and had anoxia, that phosphorus kept coming up from the sediment. And the ton of phosphorus had been stored in that sediment. They calculated it would literally take hundreds of years for the nutrients in the sediments to wash out of the system, given the inflow, the turnover, and then the outflow. So what they decided to do was take the top ½ meter of sediment and dredge it out of the entire lake. They took that out and they spread it on cropland and sold it as topsoil after they dried it out. And they improved the water quality. Fish could survive in the lake again, and humans could recreate on it. And so this is a lake near a town in Sweden that they were thinking about filling in. It was in such bad shape, and they were able to restore it. But this cost a lot. So Lake Washington, you could not do this because this is only 1 meter deep and it's much smaller. Lake Washington is a huge lake, so it wouldn't work. And here's a picture of Lake Truman and a old medieval church. You can see it looks like it's pretty good shape now. Next one, Lake Tahoe, ultra oligotrophic lake in Nevada, California border. And here's a picture of Lake Tahoe. It's a very nice lake, beautiful ultra oligotrophic lake. If you get a chance to visit, you should. The retention time of water in that lake is 700 years. So once a nutrient dumps in there, it's going to just stay in there for a long time because it's a very big, deep lake with a very small watershed. Hence, it's quite oligotrophic. It's in the Sierra Nevadas and it gets its precipitation from snow. So there were septic systems that were polluting the lake. There's no active sewage treatment. It was a bunch of cabins and lodges and such that had septic systems. And there's a lot of detergent input, so the phosphorus is dumping in, and the lake was quite nitrogen limited. They put in sewage lines and started pumping the sewage out of the basin, and it switched from nitrogen limitation to phosphorus limitation. And simultaneously, watershed disturbance increased nitrogen inputs. So there's continued construction and lots of ski areas that basically go down the slopes and towards the lake. And this caused a lot of sediment to enter the lake. And then there were some other things people were doing, like when you have downhill races, you ice the slope because the downhill racers want to have ice. They want to be going on ice because it's really fast. So there's basically a nitrate compound they throw on there. So they were dumping a bunch of nitrate on the snow, and then that would all melt and slide in to the lake. The Secchi depths are now about 20 meters rather than 40 meters. So around here, that would be a pretty exceptional, but the clarity's decreased by half. The future of the lake's a little bit uncertain. There's some problems with it. All of the nearshore activity is really bringing up the nutrients, and so their benthic algae is really high there. There's some other stuff that's going on. I just ran through a consulting report where mysis, which is a shrimp, was added in, a freshwater macrocrustacean was added in because they thought it would stimulate the fish production of the non-native fishes that were in there, but are used for recreation. Pardon me. But it turns out that it eats the daphnia. And so the daphnia were knocking down some of the chlorophyll. And they think that that has altered the clarity as well. So they want to go and net all the mysis out of that whole lake. I don't think it's very viable. So it continues to be a issue. It's a huge tourist draw because of the casinos and the ski areas, and because it's a beautiful lake. But being on the border of Nevada and California, there has to be an interstate compact and regulation of both sides, or else the problem will continue to get bad. And there's a picture of Charles Goldman in here, and he actually, the prior book, I couldn't get permission for this one photograph, but the President Clinton and Vice President Al Gore came to the lake. There's a picture of them lowering a Secchi disc over the edge of the research vessel. So that was kind of cool. The news article on it said President Clinton lowers dinner plate over the edge of the boat, or something like that, because I think it went from a Secchi disc to something about the size of a dinner plate to a dinner plate. But you know, that's the popular media. Okay, we'll switch to the wetland stuff, and we're back to the Everglades and Okeechobee. So ag fertilizer runoff has caused algal blooms in Lake Okeechobee and loss of native plants and algal communities in Everglades. So as you fertilize the Everglades, the phosphorus from agriculture causes a switch over to these cattails, and so you have a much less diverse system. And the species that depend upon the Everglades, like the Everglades snail kite, those snails are not able to grow in the cattails as well. And we've talked about the hydrology, trying to restore the hydrology of the Everglades and Okeechobee. And the canals and locks are decreasing the natural flushing through the system. So the attempts to try to restore natural hydrology, you can go back to that chapter and look at the wetland chapter where we talk about this. And what they're doing is they've got these wetland areas that they're going to sacrifice that will take the phosphorus out of the water before it gets into the restored Everglades. So they have agriculture to the north, and then north of the Everglades and around Lake Okeechobee. And then as the water flows down, it goes through these large treatment wetlands, and then leaves those. The clean water then can be shunted into the Everglades to keep it in its natural system. There's a really charged issue because the ag lobby in southern Florida is really powerful, huge tax base. And now what they've done is they've dumped water into the ocean from Okeechobee because it's also got algal blooms, and it's causing algal blooms in the marine system. It's not clear if these problems will be solved, but these toxic algal blooms moving into the ocean, to the nearby coastal ocean, have really caught the attention of people. And even the more conservative politicians are now have their planks are for re-election are related to they're strong on the environment and controlling these problems. So this has been a big shift in Florida in the last couple of years related to that. So here's a picture of Lake Okeechobee. It's the largest lake in Florida. It's quite a large lake. You can be seen from space, and you can see the agriculture right up to the edges, all the way around this lake. And then you can see cyanobacterial blooms on the lake, and they're also in streaks. So what are the streaks from? What's that? We're talking about going back in time. Not a sage.
Langmuir.
Langmuir circulation patterns, right? Remember the wind's going this way in that image, and the pattern are causing these linear streaks of algae to be on the surface. So these are the cyanobacterial blooms that were dumped off into the ocean and killing marine life and making it impossible to recreate there. So wetlands are nutrient sinks, and they can be used for tertiary treatment. I just mentioned that sort of with the Everglades. But many places, they actually will put an artificial wetland in downstream of the sewage treatment plant if they want to keep nutrients out. And they tend to be better at nitrogen and phosphorus removal because the nitrate eventually becomes denitrified. So it's always losing nitrogen gas to the atmosphere. Phosphorus is taken up in the sediments and in the plants, and then it has nowhere to go. So you'll saturate up the phosphorus. So what they have to do is they have to harvest the plants away and take them off and compost them in the field somewhere or something like that. So they're useful in that, but also many natural wetlands are oligotrophic, and so nutrient pollution really destroys the natural system. And we saw in the previous chapter these wetland fertilizations showing which nutrients limited wetlands. And it can push them, as we talked about with the Everglades, to undesirable species, to monocultures of species, and things that basically don't provide the same ecosystem services that the intact wetland does.
Do you know if they've thought about using like the water or the, I don't know why I can't think of the sediment from like Okeechobee instead of like buying fertilizer, like artificial fertilizer?
Yeah, so they could, although it's not that rich. But yeah, that's a possibility. It's just such a huge lake that you'd have to take so much sediment out that it's not really feasible. Any other questions? That was a good one.